Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be doing a bonus video in our series on debunking the Modal Ontological Argument 6 ways from Sunday. So technically it's going to be 7 ways from Sunday, I suppose, but don't worry, there'll be some 6s involved. Anyway, in this video we are going to be looking at Inspiring Philosophy's other video responding to some more objections to the Modal Ontological Argument. Over the course of this week, while I was looking at all the videos I had made for this series, I'd responded to almost all of Inspiring Philosophy's videos, so I wanted to be clear that there's not some fantastic objection here that's going to disprove all of my points. So, what this is going to be is my objections to Inspiring Philosophy's responses to the objections to the Modal Ontological Argument, Part 2. Now, the objections he's going to look at here are Goldbach's conjecture, the Omniscience Paradox, necessity not being a great-making property, the correct atheist argument, and a Plantinga Quote that apparently some people have claimed disproves the Modal Ontological Argument. Let's take a look. But first, when last we left our objection count, we were at about 36. But actually, in the last video, I counted about 12 more objections that I counted as objection 36 still. So technically, our objection count is at 48, just to keep it current. We're going to keep that counter going through the rest of this video. So, the first objection that Inspiring Philosophy is going to look at is the Modal Ontological Argument for the truth of Goldbach's conjecture. It goes something like this. Basically, it says that Goldbach's conjecture can be proved with the modal ontological argument, but clearly we can't prove mathematical proofs with such an argument, so the modal ontological argument fails. Let's take a look. It is possible that Goldbach's conjecture is true. If it is possible that Goldbach's conjecture is true, then it is true in some possible worlds. If Goldbach's conjecture is true in some possible worlds, then Goldbach's conjecture is true in all possible worlds. If Goldbach's conjecture is true in all possible worlds, then Goldbach's conjecture is true in the actual world. If Goldbach's conjecture is true in the actual world, then Goldbach's conjecture is true. Wow, I'm getting tired of that form of argument. So, the point is, it implies a contradiction or an absurdity that we can prove mathematical truths with proofs like this, with modal proofs like this, so it doesn't make sense for us to use this kind of proof at all. What Inspiring Philosophy is going to say in response to this is that we cannot test an infinite set of numbers to know if it's true in some possible worlds. For those of you who are curious, Goldbach's conjecture looks like all even integers greater than 2 can be expressed as the sum of 2 primes. It's something that seems to be the case for numbers as big as we can count, but we can't actually have a proof of it. The problem is that it seems that in fact we can test an infinite set of numbers to know whether or not it's true in possible worlds. For example, we have tested an infinite set of numbers involved in the fundamental theorem of arithmetic. Let's take a look. That says all integers greater than 1 are either prime or the product of primes. If the claim, we cannot test an infinite set of numbers to know if it is true in some possible world, is correct, then we couldn't prove this claim because we couldn't test that infinite set of numbers. But we can and we have proven this theorem, or at least mathematics has. So as long as you believe in math, you should be able to believe in the fundamental theorem of arithmetic and that we can prove these kind of things. I think most theists probably believe in math. I'm not sure. So that's going to be objection 49. We can prove theorems about infinite sets. Therefore, we should be able to prove Goldbach's conjecture. Also, implicit in his response is the idea that we can know about the properties of God to see if they're coherent, and in fact we know more about them than we can know about numbers. This seems to be such a ridiculous claim, I'm going to offer some objections to it. Objection 50. We've never directly experienced anything that's omnipotent or omniscient, and yet we have worked with numbers since most of us were very young. So it seems strange to say that we know more about omnipotence or omniscience than we do about numbers. If we know anything, it seems that we know about numbers. As a skeptic, I'm not sure if we know anything, but it seems that if we knew something, we'd know something about things we've experienced and worked with since we were young, and not about things that we've never experienced and may not even exist. Objection 51. We all disagree as to what moral perfection looks like, but anyone that understands and believes in math agrees on mathematical proofs. How then is moral perfection, this property of God, something that is more coherent in some way than numbers? In fact, moral perfection seems to be one of the most contentious issues that exist. I don't see how we can claim that we know more about moral perfection than we do about numbers. Once again, as a skeptic, I'm not sure if we know anything, but that's to the side. So, He also says, in order to know if something is true in a possible world, we have to know everything about it. Wow, that's a really worrying claim. Objection 52. How do we know that God is true in a possible world when we cannot give the content of all God's mental states? Note, if we could give the content of all God's mental states, we would know everything, because God is omniscient. However, we can't give the content of all God's mental states. We're not omniscient, so we can't know everything about God, so we can't know he's true in a possible world. So that kind of defeats premise 1 of the modal ontological argument. I'm really worried about it. And I'm not even sure any religion even claims to know everything about God. Maybe there is one out there, and if you know of one, please post it below. But it seems to me most religions think of God as something mysterious, or at the very least, God's plan is something mysterious, and that's kind of one of the ways people use a theodicy to explain away evil. One way or another, it seems to be really worrying. Next up, Objection 2 is contradictions in God's properties. This is kind of the omnipotence paradox revisited in the form of omniscience, and it's kind of a little bit like the problem of evil. Let's take a look. So, part 2a of this, there's 2 parts. God's omniscience conflicts with his omnipotence. This is basically saying that, well, God can know things about the future, therefore God can't change the future. Inspiring Philosophy is going to run a similar objection to this that he does to the original omnipotence paradox. So, I'm going to respond with the same response I had before. Objection number 7, the solution to the omnipotence paradox moves the goalpost. Check out my video if you're curious. The other one is kind of a more new objection, though once again, it's a little bit of rehashing of the problem of evil. So, God's omniscience conflicts with his moral goodness, basically saying God knew all of the things that were evil that are going to happen and didn't do anything about it. So it doesn't seem that he's morally good. Once again, it's kind of the problem of evil with the omnipotence paradox and the omniscience problem mixed in together. The solutions he's going to offer are, God knows all the possibilities, but allows us to choose between them. I'm a little concerned. Objection 54, does God know what we are going to choose? If he does, why would he create us such that we would choose evil? Why could he not create us such that we would choose good? If not, why should we believe he's omniscient? Objection 55, this implies libertarianism. If you don't know what that is, check out my video on free will, and that implies some really strange things. And finally, objections 8 through 9, there's some problems for the free will defense. These objections may be needed a little bit to support objection 54 if people say that God does know what we're going to choose, but he couldn't have created beings that would freely choose something. Like I said, there seem to be problems for the free will defense. Check out those objections if you're curious. Solution number 2, God exists outside of time. Inspiring Philosophy says that this is a more convincing objection to him. I would agree that if you assume God exists outside of time, it seems that the objection goes away. But the problem is, I'm not sure what the justification for the claim that God exists outside of time is. Is there anything else that one can point to that exists outside of time? Is there some argument that you have to show that God exists outside of time? I'd be really curious to see such an argument, because I think it'd be fascinating, and also because I think there'd be a lot of spots you could object to it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'd love to see the argument. That brings us to the claim that necessity is not a great-making property. The objection for this goes something like this. A piece of music written by Mozart has some great-making properties. However, a piece of music would not be made greater by being necessary. Therefore, necessity is not a great-making property. I've offered some objections similar to this that object to the idea of necessity being a great-making property, but this is actually a pretty interesting one. Inspiring Philosophy is going to respond to this objection as follows. Necessity can only be a great-making property for something that can be necessary. A piece of music by Mozart requires Mozart, a contingent being, to create it. Necessary things cannot be created by contingent things, therefore a piece of music written by Mozart cannot be necessary. Therefore, necessity cannot make a piece of music written by Mozart great. An interesting claim, but let's see if we can object to it. In order to do so, let's have a little music lesson. So there's something known as a perfect fifth. This is a very good or enjoyable, pleasurable ratio of note to note on a keyboard. There's a lot of different perfect fifths depending on where you start on the keyboard, but the moral of the story is it is a fantastic ratio of the wavelengths of the sound such that they come together and they create something that is seen in almost all music. Whereas you also have ratios of notes such as this, which are very discordant and don't sound very good to the ear. It would seem that a perfect fit has some great-making properties. In fact, it's even called perfect. It was used in a lot of church music, while this ratio was considered to be the devil's ratio, or the devil's triad, and it in fact was not allowed in church music. Interesting. Anyway, so a perfect fifth has some great-making properties. However, a perfect fifth would not be made greater by being necessary. Just because this existed in all possible worlds doesn't mean that it has become somehow better in its being a perfect fifth. Therefore, necessity isn't a great-making property. The full argument would go as follows. This is Objection 57. Perfect fifths are not made greater by being necessary. Necessity can only be a great-making property for something that can be necessary. A perfect fifth does not require a contingent being to create it. Necessary things cannot be created by contingent things. Therefore, a perfect fifth can be necessary. Therefore, necessity could make a perfect fifth greater, but it doesn't. In fact, therefore, necessity is not a great-making property. Perhaps someone would object to this by saying, a perfect fifth is not something that is as great as a full piece of music, so it doesn't really qualify. Well, alright, let's go a step up. There is a progression of chords that exists. That's 1, 5, minor 6, 4. This progression of chords is used in a gratuitous amount of pop music and all music that exists. You hear it almost anywhere you go, even if you don't know it. It seems that the four chords progression has some great-making properties, as it exists in most all of music. However, the four chords progression would not be made greater by being necessary. It wouldn't be made greater by existing in all possible worlds. Therefore, necessity is not a great-making property. Objection 58, the four chords progression is not made greater by being necessary. Necessity can only be a great-making property for something that can be necessary. The fourth chord progression does not require a contingent being to create it. Similar to a perfect fifth, which could just exist by two things vibrating or existing at the right wavelength, the four chords progression could exist by a series of things vibrating in an order. As long as it ends up in that order, it'll be fine, and it will be the four chords progression. It doesn't require some specific contingent thing to create it. Therefore, the four chords progression can be necessary. Therefore, necessity could make the four chords progression greater, but it in fact does not. Maybe one will object even to this, but the four chords progression alone is not something that's great as a full piece of music, so it doesn't really qualify. In that case, listen to this. It seems that Don't Stop Believing would be as close as we can get to perfection in music, clearly. However, it uses nothing but the four chords progression and throws in a little bit of a rhythm. It seems that Don't Stop Believing has some great-making properties. However, Don't Stop Believing would not be made greater by being necessary. Therefore, necessity is not a great-making property. Objection 59, Don't Stop Believing is not made greater by being necessary. Necessity can only be a great-making property for something that can be necessary. Don't Stop Believing does not require a contingent being to create it. Note, all we've done on top of the four chords progression is added a little bit of rhythm. It doesn't seem to be something so ridiculous that atoms could vibrate at such a frequency to create this piece of music. Necessary things cannot be created by contingent things. Therefore, Don't Stop Believing can be necessary because it doesn't need to be created by a contingent thing. Therefore, necessity could make Don't Stop Believing greater, but it does not. Now, perhaps one might object. The music is still created by something, even if that's just atoms vibrating. Those atoms themselves are contingent. Therefore, music cannot be necessary. In response to this, here's the argument I would offer.
All atoms necessarily vibrate at various frequencies. We've been unable to perfectly stop something from vibrating, perfectly get all the way down to absolute zero. There are over 1 quadrillion vigintillion atoms in the universe. I would say, odds are that some of them are vibrating to a tune of. Music can exist without an author. Music can be necessary.
That's objection number 60. Music does not require a single contingent thing to create it. The next objection he's going to look at is called the correct atheist argument. This is actually very similar to the reverse ontological argument, but we're going to formulate it a little bit differently. It goes as follows. It is possible that a non-sentient world exists. Since a non-sentient world is not incoherent, then it is a possible world. If a possible world is a non-sentient world, then God does not exist in that world. Therefore, God does not exist in every possible world. Therefore, God is not necessary and instead impossible. Like I said, pretty similar to the reverse ontological argument, but he's going to offer some different objections. So, in this case, he makes a distinction between logical possibility, something that contains no self-contradictions, and metaphysical possibility, something that's more restrictive than logical possibility. Anyone who's accustomed to philosophical discussions should immediately have a red flag here, because that description that we just gave of metaphysical possibility isn't actually a description of what metaphysical possibility is. It perhaps is a characteristic of metaphysical possibility, but it's not a description of what it is. Perhaps you would think you can go look this up in your general philosophical encyclopedia. However, this distinction doesn't actually exist, at least not in the literature that I have seen or read. More restrictive than logical possibility is not a definition. You've just made up this distinction and then not defined it. If you wanted to make up a distinction, that would be fine, as long as you gave really specific ways in which something can be metaphysically or logically possible. You've done it for logical possibility, but you failed to do it for metaphysical possibility. Similarly, I can't define a tree as something that's larger than a whale, bacteria as something that's smaller than a pin, knowledge as something more restrictive than belief, or squareness as something more restrictive than rectanglehood. While all of these things may be true or may be the case, that does not mean that that's a definition of it, or an explicit or complete definition. Your definition of metaphysical possibility is significantly lacking in what way is it more restrictive than logical possibility. It's a significant problem, and it's just a ridiculous distinction to come up with in the first place. However, we're going to allow and assume this distinction to continue and move forward with the argument. So, the correct atheist is taking as their first premise, it is possible that there is a non-sentient world, while the ontological argument takes as its first premise it is possible that a maximally great being exists. What we're going to claim is that the ontological argument has additional reasons, while the correct atheist argument does not have additional reasons. So, the ontological one is metaphysical, and the correct atheist one is logical. Like I said, we're setting aside this distinction for now. What I'm going to show in the next couple of objections is, in fact, the ontological argument doesn't really have additional reasons, while the correct atheist argument does. First, an argument for it is possible that there is a non-sentient world. The parts of the world that have sentience are non-essential to it being a world. If all of a sudden all of those parts of the world that have sentience, probably just all the humans, disappeared, then the world would still be a world. If even all living things disappeared, the world would still be a world. According to science, at least, most of the world is not alive. Most of the universe, that is. When we're talking about worlds, remember we're talking about the entirety of the world, anything we can get to physically, not just the world as an Earth. If X loses non-essential parts to being Y, it is still a kind of Y. Therefore, if the actual world lost all of its sentient parts, it would still be a possible world. Therefore, a non-sentient world is possible. Therefore, we just provided some great reasons for the correct atheist argument. To claim that it has no reasons, or we take it based on faith, is just incorrect. Objection 62. Now we go into something that's just a ridiculous problem. We claim that repeated failed attempts to show that God is incoherent justify a pessimistic inference. This is straight up the fallacy of appeal to ignorance. It's clearly this fallacy. That's objection 63. Just because something has yet to be disproved does not prove it. It's a logical fallacy. It's a problem. And I'm concerned that someone would think that that's a valid inference. Now let's take a look at our justification for the metaphysical modal ontological argument. This justification supposedly allows it to be classified as metaphysically possible instead of logically possible. Still really worried about that distinction. In order to have metaphysical possibility, the modal ontological argument must have some other reasons for it. Those reasons are the other arguments for the existence of God, the cosmological, the teleological, and the moral arguments, etc. This would be fine for now if we didn't go here and say that this does not make the argument rest on these other arguments. It seems to, in fact, completely make this argument rest on the other arguments. And if those arguments fall apart, there's no reason for us to believe this argument. Why? Without the other arguments, the modal ontological argument is only logical and not metaphysical. That's all we've just said. The only other reasons are these other arguments. If we didn't have those other reasons, it wouldn't be metaphysically possible. If the modal ontological argument is only logical and not metaphysical, then it is no better than the correct atheist argument. That was the original correct atheist objection. If it is no better than the correct atheist argument, there is no reason to believe one over the other, and in fact, the modal ontological argument as an argument itself is pretty flawed. That's objection 64. The ontological argument must be supported by other arguments for the existence of God, because, as we see, if it's not, the correct atheist argument will succeed. Now we say all attempts to argue that God is impossible have failed. Before you accept this on face value, check out my objections 7, 8, and 9, as well as a lot of other literature that exists online. Finally, the last objection he's going to tackle is the Plantinga Quote. I'm not going to give you the whole Plantinga Quote right now. I'm going to give you a summary of it and explain what he says, what he, Inspiring Philosophy, says about it. Inspiring Philosophy says the modal ontological argument cannot and should not be used to prove that God exists. Wow, that seems to be a very skeptical claim. No argument in natural theology can be said to prove God exists. Goodness, we seem to be giving the atheist everything they want right now. However, we're going to say that the best inference we can come to is that God exists. Basically, what we say is that you can either believe in God or believe that there is no God. The former is more rational, the latter is less rational. There's a couple problems here. First of all, where's your argument for this? The modal ontological argument doesn't talk about rationality at all, so I don't see how you can have a conclusion that includes the idea of rationality. The modal ontological argument doesn't talk about believing that there is no God. That's not even in there. The concept of belief isn't even present in the modal ontological argument, so I don't see how we get to this conclusion. As objection 65, the ontological argument said nothing about its claim being the more rational option. It was in fact trying to logically prove it, or seem to logically prove it. The more concerning thing, however, is that this is actually a false dichotomy. It's claiming that there are only two options. You can believe in X or you can believe in Y. Definitely begging the question against the skeptic. There's another option. Believing in God, more rational. Believing that there is no God, less rational. If you take that as kind of the dogmatic atheist perspective that believes the statement, there is no God, I would agree. That's a less rational position to hold. Or at least, it's not a terribly rational position to hold. However, once again, this is a false dichotomy because there's a third option. It's called suspending judgment, skepticism, which is, to fill out our nice chart, the most rational option. Because there seem to be arguments against God, there seem to be arguments for God. None of them succeed, so all we can be left to do is suspend judgment. That's objection number 66. Believing and disbelieving are not the only options. QED, skepticism. For those of you keeping score at home, that was not 1, not 2, not 3, but 66 objections to the modal ontological argument for the existence of God. Therefore, I implore you, I beseech you, I entreat you, please stop believing. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org and stay skeptical, everybody.